This is your last chance. After this...
Or should we not follow the advice of the galactically stupid?
That is a nice boulder.
Ludicrous speed! Go!
Ladies and gentlemen, coming to you pre-recorded from two undersized apartments in New York City, it's Revenge of the Film Nerds.
There, we're in a tight spot.
I hate when people talk during the movie.
With your hosts, Black Crystal.
I'm not bad. I'm just drawn that way.
And Jack Manley.
What we've got here is failure to communicate.
A podcast for nerds by nerds.
Oh, you betcha, yeah.
Failure is not an option.
And now, here are your hosts, Black Crystal and Jack Manley.
What's up, everybody, and welcome to Revenge of the Film Nerds. I am Black Crystal, and I'm joined with the lovely Jack Manley, and we're about to put you on to such an amazing film today. Now, this week, we have done, Jack, you've got to let them know this beautiful animation we brought to their screens today.
Yes, indeed. This week, we have gone very much up your alley. You know I've got you on the hookup when it comes to classic films, when it comes to a lot of live-action stuff. That's what I've always loved. But I do have a sweet spot for animation, and I've got a sweet spot for this one, which is why I'm glad you wanted to do it. It is 1997's Princess Mononoke, written and directed by Hayao Miyazaki and produced by Toshio Suzuki. And BK, right off the bat, I'm just going to put in this disclaimer for the people. I apologize wholeheartedly for the many, many Japanese names I am about to butcher over the course of this podcast.
Oh, man, you just did a good job, though, so no worries. You look promising, Jack, okay? It's promising.
You know, it's a fun experience for me this week because I just do not have that, focus on Japanese heritage, on Japanese culture, on Japanese history, really beyond sort of the ways in which it's intertwined with American history. So it's going to be something that I really get to learn about through discussing this film with you. So I'm really excited. And I'm excited because Princess Mononoke is such a beautiful film with such a simple story. It is the story of Prince Ashitaka, who, after protecting his village from an attack and being marked for death by a demon, he has to travel to the heart of the forest in, I guess what you would call it, feudal or Muromachi period Japan, to undo this curse that he has come under. But he discovers along the way that he's actually caught right in the middle of a massive conflict between the natural world and the progress of humanity and of industry. And it is at this point during the struggle he realizes that to save himself and the others trapped in these violent conflicts, he has to actually save the forest, save the ecosystem itself. It's an incredibly taut, expressive film. And even though it has a 2-hour runtime, you never once feel like you're off the edge of your seat, BK. To get to this film, to get to the completed product, it doesn't seem like it was an easy process because from what I understand, the birth of Studio Ghibli was a little bit turbulent.
Oh, totally. It really was something that kind of was like a dream between Hayao Miyazaki and Toshio. They were bros in the workplace, if that makes sense. You have your coworkers who you're friends with, and you're like, okay, cool, let's try this project. They worked a lot on different works before this. I think the most notably one would be Nausicaa. I was really surprised when I did a little bit more research into this for the podcast today that Nausicaa was a manga that they created before it was a film. I never knew that.
Now, that's very interesting. You see, that's just another level of Japanese culture that I'm not really inundated with. I know from watching anime that so many animations that we love come from manga, but I just do not have the experience that you do with Japanese cultures. Correct me if I'm wrong, BK. You've actually spent time living in Japan and actually learning this context firsthand.
Yes, I was very fortunate to have a chance to stay over there. I had a host family and everything, so I did the as close to authentic experience as you could have. It was an amazing experience, and I think what makes it super relevant to this podcast is I actually went over to study philosophy, Eastern philosophy, so Shinto, Buddhism, and things like that. So my programs for classes that I was taking had to be, studying with Zen Buddhist monks and visiting temples and traveling a lot of places over the area.
Unreal. That sounds like an incredible experience.
So beautiful. It was something that I'd always wanted to do, and really being able to kind of connect to the teachings that I was learning and experience the culture. I had a very found admiration for the culture. Most of us blurs due to an unhealthy obsession, which is not good, but I wanted to appreciate it for what it was. I didn't want to kind of assume what the culture was. So I really made it a goal for me to be able to visit there and be able to learn. And I learned so much, and a lot of it is really about this manga culture, this anime culture. We kind of talk about how it does come from Japan, but we never really know the ins and outs. Like you were saying, Jack, most of the anime we love does come from source material, whether it's a manga that's been into it, maybe a webtoon, or maybe it's a light novel that's been translated into animation. Typically, films, though, animated films don't often have source material. So the reason why I bring up Nausicaa is odd, because I never realized how behind the scenes Miyazaki was with everything that he does. And having that kind of source material there, I found out that Nausicaa and making that a film was kind of the birth and the inspiration of the studio itself with his producer.
So Miyazaki was really pulling from pre-established Japanese traditions in order to create something new and unique.
Absolutely. It was taking that new lens, that pop culture kind of manga approach, but talking about, more mature themes, inspirational themes. You really set the tone for that. I feel that highbrow anime that you watch, where you go in for an experience and not just laughs and jokes.
It's funny you mentioned that, because I mean that for a lot of people, I would guess slightly older than us, but people who have been exposed to Japanese culture coming into America now for a period of roughly 50 years, a lot of people's first experience was stuff that was like the old dubs of Speed Racer. It titillated, it entertained, but it was largely derided in America, and it was largely sort of lampooned, particularly for the sort of haphazard way in which America would dub these what they would call Japanimations at the time in bringing them over. So to see Miyazaki approaching anime with a really serious and critical eye is something really interesting. And from what I can understand, it made a genuine impact on the Japanese film industry, not just Japanese animation.
It was astounding. I mean, it was the first animated film to win the Japan Academy Prize for Picture of the Year.
Wow.
So that had never happened before. I mean, can you imagine that happening here? An animated film winning Picture of the Year? I'm sorry, what? I mean, right, you're surprised, like, not even, Into the Spider-Verse? Like, there's a high bar, right?
No one's ever accused the Academy of, being with the cutting edge, so I can understand why Into the Spider-Verse might not be their fare.
Valid. But to kind of, add to that, like, with this film, it's kind of the weight of it is what I'm stressing, is that this was something that wasn't aimed just for kids. This was aimed for a mature audience. There was attention to detail. This was something that was groundbreaking in the industry, to have an animated motion picture film with as much investment as a normal film, if not more, than at the time. And I say not more for the workload that it takes, because boy, putting this film together was a beast for Miyazaki. And let me tell you, there's so many ins and outs bits that I've been reading about on literally just like how it's created, its elements from drawing, from CG to literally landscaping. Everything about the creation of this film is really like, I feel like Miyazaki's spirit child. He really said he was going to make this film. At the start, this was going to be the film he would retire on, which is kind of terrifying, because we never would have gotten Spirited Away if he retired after this film.
It's unbelievable, with the the added years. We now know that Hayao Miyazaki has tried to retire about as many times as Jay-Z. So you always take it with a grain of salt now.
Valid.
But at the time, yeah, it being sort of the first retirement of his, that is a deeply interesting kind of sentiment, is that this was kind of the one filmic statement he really wanted to make, and this was going to be sort of emblematic of his vision. And as you mentioned, there are a lot of very important elements relative to Japan and Japanese culture in this film, including Shinto traditions, hallmarks regarding the relationship with nature. But as you were telling me when we were getting ready to record, a lot of those touches that were very idiosyncratic to Japan almost didn't make it over to the United States.
Oh, yeah. Dude, the story behind this is crazy. So Miramax was negotiating the deal with Ghibli to release the dub over to the U.S. And it's, Harvey Weinstein was the chairman at the time. You know who he is, all right? We don't mess with him, all right?
Moving swiftly onward.
Yes. But he really wanted to cut several scenes from the film that really showcased its ties to Japanese history and its environmental message. And they almost didn't make it. And Miyazaki's producer, this guy, my man, Toshio, right, said, hell nah, nothing's happened. And he sent an authentic katana to his house that said no cuts.
Ooh. Wow.
No cuts.
I am Irish and German. I do not have any Italian or Sicilian blood, but that is roughly one step away from sending the Black Hand to somebody's mailbox.
No, for sure. That's some mafia shit right there. That's crazy.
It's crazy, but hey, I will choose to chalk that up as a story of a producer sticking up for their film. And folks, producers are the people who really do handle all the back office nitty gritty. They get the schedule together. They make sure that the production is running smoothly and handle all those headaches. And the joke I learned when I was being educated in film is that the only thanks the producer ever gets is that Best Picture Oscar at the end of the day. But this is the level of dedication that these people do have to art and to the artists they work with. And it's a terrifying story in one perspective, because you're sending a man a katana, but at the same time, it's a real testament to how much he believed in Miyazaki and his work. And that kind of emphatic statement probably preserved it for an American audience.
Absolutely. I think that film wouldn't make any sense with any of the supposed cuts that they're talking about. And to further add the importance and the relevance of the Japanese history and the environmentalism message that Miyazaki wanted to share with this film, how integral that was to literally just viewing it. Like, without those elements, you wouldn't be watching the story Miyazaki intended.
Well, absolutely. And it kicks off really within the first 15 minutes of the film as you see something that is very unique to Japanese culture. Now, in America, we have always understood ourselves to this point to be a conglomeration of 50 states into one nation. And that national identity is a big part of who we are. But when you watch a lot of Japanese culture, particularly culture that is focused around feudal Japan, you see a very factional, fractured society where circumstances change when you go from village to village. The period in Japan was so marked by division because while the shoguns did have power and technically, quote unquote, ran the country, the rich had hired samurai to such a degree that all power was local in Japan. And that starts to play a part because after Ashitaka saves his village from this boar that has been impacted by what we later find out is an iron bullet that corrupted it and turned it into a demon, his first journey away from his village, he can't have gone more than 15 miles before he is caught in the middle of a bloody battle. And we see the first real approach of this film to the subject of war and violence.
Oh, man, Jack, you brought me in on so many levels. I was ready to go on. I was like, yo, look, So let's break it down for y'all right quick. Let's talk about the Muromachi period right quick, guys. Let's talk about this because this is it. This is like prime romance, like the stuff you see in the games like Neo, where you see all the shoguns, you see the samurais, your boy Obo Nobunaga. Like that's the stuff you're seeing here. Right. So during this time, though, there's so many elements that I feel like Miyazaki really like went in to build the world of Princess Mononoke at that era and then tie it into its relevance, like you were saying, into the war themes that are happening at that time and the history of Japan's time. Because Japan is full of war and destruction, unfortunately. And we romanticize it a lot.
And that was one thing that really struck me is much like last week when we watched Apocalypse Now and we sort of didn't reach a conclusion on whether or not it was pro or anti-war. I sort of feel the same way about Princess Mononoke. Is I get the sense that, like a lot of Japanese culture post-World War II, there is this acceptance of violence and conflict in a very sort of matter-of-fact fashion.
Yes.
It's, it feels almost like a rote analysis at this point to say that that is a reaction to being the only nation to ever suffer the true horror of atomic disasters at Hiroshima and Nagasaki when the bomb was dropped by the United States on both cities. And that does play into a lot of culture, including Akira, which became the first real Japanese feature-length animation to come to the United States. But those themes and the sort of understanding that violence is a natural consequence of living, it's a tough message to take, but it's one that is, in being taken as a fact of life in Mononoke, frees up the characters to not be imprisoned by violence. You even see it when Ashitaka meets Jigo, the monk character, when he is trying to buy rice in the village. Is Jigo makes a big show of showing off the gold piece that he has handed to a vendor. And you're sitting there thinking, especially in a feudal period, this guy's flashing gold in the middle of the city. Like, how has he not been stabbed immediately?
Right.
How is he not, or at least getting his purse cut? And yet, as he and Ashitaka walk away from the village, Jigo quickly notices that they're being pursued and just flat out outruns the violence that is headed his way. He is so aware of the possibilities that he is confronted with that he's able to lead Ashitaka to safety because he's liberated in a way from fear over violence because violence just is.
That is such a great way you put it. Violent just is. What is a good quote as well? Another theme from the film is everybody wants everything. Like this acceptance of like the chaoticness and very animalistic nature of people. And I think it's super integral to Japan's history, like you said, Jack.
Oh, no question. And it's a great quote to come from Jigo because, as we will discover, he's one of the more unscrupulous characters in this world. He's also one of the most wise because he's telling you the rules of a very sort of sick game. He doesn't necessarily believe in it, but he's going to play it because it's the way to survive. And that really sets up, I think, the mood of the rest of the film, because when Ashitaka, he has these moments where he is at peace and at one with nature, and in these moments he does great things, including saving some villagers that have survived an attack, Irontown villagers, and in taking them through the forest amongst a lot of spirits, which are sort of our first induction into really strong Shinto imagery within the film. Despite his, peaceful interactions with nature, every interaction he has with civilization and every interaction he has with people boils down to violence and division.
It's aggression. It is very stratified, which is a great depiction of the landscape of the time period, the Muromachi time period that it's set in. But also, I would say at the time of things being created. A lot of ideals were being shifted around at that time about what people believed in and things like that. So I feel like what Miyazaki does so well to kind of bring the viewer is in that scene is really kind of take these themes that are super organic to the time period that it's set in, but also very relevant to the viewer itself at a more, contemporary context.
No question. But I will say, before we get to sort of the grittiness and the dunginess of Irontown, I feel like we can't just gloss over these scenes of nature that we've already been exposed to in the first half hour of the film, because the animation work is gorgeous, BK.
Oh, Miyazaki, baby, Ghibli, yes. Sorry, yeah.
No. Hey, listen, if you've got to go off on it, go off on it. I've rarely seen in live action or animation more beautifully done landscapes and a more sort of beautifully rendered setting. Now, from what I understand, again, this is where you're going to have to cover for me with my gaps in my knowledge of Japan. These forests were based on actual locations in Japan, were they not?
Yes, so Jack, they actually took out the animation team to this place on location, on site, to draw the almost replicas of certain areas in the ancient forests of Yakushima and the mountains. Some of my Japanese friends, like when they watch this, they're like, that is that mountain range. That's Shirakami Shachi. Like, that's it. Like, you can tell. So that nuance there of it being very attuned to Japanese culture and history, when you have someone who has that lens watching this, you're more than transported through time, right? You're there. You can just see it there. And it's stunning, the attention to detail. Like, some of these images, guys, you're gonna have to look them up, because like they're like one for one in some of the frames. You're looking at like logs turned half over, moss, like the way the moss grows over the trees, and all the little tree spirits are there, and they're cute. You can see it, man. I'm gonna have to get you some side by sides.
I mean, it's the way it's even down to when they have these wide establishing shots. It's right down to the mist coming off of the top layer of the forest in the early morning. It's so evocative. You can almost get those forest smells and those forest sort of sounds in your head without having them aided there. And you just have to give credit in particular to the 5 background artists that sort of took the lead here. And again, BK, this is where I might start butchering names, but Jisan Yamamoto, Naoya Tanaka, Yoji Takei, Satoshi Kuroda, and Kazuo Oga, their work in animating these backdrops and animating the settings of Mononoke is one of the aspects that really sets it apart. And it's not just the beauty they render in nature, it's the way that they juxtapose it so brilliantly with the accoutrement of a civilization just finding itself and just beginning to find industry. And that conflict in the way that both they're animated is, I think, essential to feeling the conflict of the rest of the film.
No, totally. It captivates you into that time, and then you're teleported to the same situation. Like, it almost like the way the film starts, right, with these shots, like you were saying, the wide shots of the scenery. I mean, the film starts just on the mountain range, and you're in it, and you're immediately in conflict as well. You kind of get to see the differences of the societies in each form of their conflict and how they do look in their environment, like from the village versus when we are at Irontown, and the cohesiveness of it and the realism of it is really what just gets me so immersed. Like, I can't, like, if you are not immersed watching this, like, I don't know what your problem is. Like, I'm sorry. Like, you gotta watch some better shit, bro. Like, oh man.
I will say, it's in getting to Irontown, it's deeply interesting because Ashitaka has, as I've mentioned, been walking through nature, which he's been warned about nature being very dangerous to the villagers. In fact, one of the injured men from Irontown that he is saving tells him explicitly no man has ever survived walking through these woods. And yet Ashitaka is unburdened by this. But the moment Irontown comes into his sights, the moment he's about to descend into the valley with these injured men, the first action he takes is to cover his face from the smell of, as it turns out, is smelting. So there's a very conflicted nature behind his own reactions in approaching this new type of civilization. But as is the case with everything in Princess Mononoke, it's not objectively bad, Irontown. It is a very human settlement. And in particular, it's very clear right off the bat that this is a fairly progressive environment for the women of Irontown.
It's where everybody comes here, the misfits, the have-nots. It's almost very conflicting for the viewer to even make this specific town an enemy, even though up to now they've been seen as very combative and not necessarily aligning with our protagonist's ideals. But like you said, it's not cut and dry. It's not black and white. And the women in this town, well, they're the manual labor there, and they come from brothels in other cities, and they do this work because it's better for them. They said the men don't bother us only unless we want them to. I think it's the best line from there, and they're very healthy. These are thick women, like they eat well. They're getting this life of hard work and pleasure at the same time, and honestly, a sense of independence. And being able to have that agency in this place. And our protagonist here, Ashitaka, begins to see that as he kind of explores the town, learns more about them, but still is very much aware that this is technically, the villain. This is his enemy, his village's enemy.
And agency is a really great word for it, because you have this environment where all of these women have agency, have real importance in the community, because in handling the bellows, they're allowing the iron to be shaped to create the rifles that this village is using to protect itself. But you've juxtaposed that both with the fact that the first shots we see of Irontown is approaching the village, the hillsides have been stripped bare and logged bare of trees. You're seeing the environment being eaten away by this town, so you develop a natural hostility to it from the word go. And Lady Eboshi certainly isn't helping that. And it's interesting because Eboshi is the first character, aside from Ashitaka, to really make her perspective on the environment clear. Like, BK, one thing I love about this film is that every single major character in the film has a different relationship with the environment. And this is where the first difference really shows it, is while Ashitaka has clearly been somebody who finds a true balance in nature and finds the most important thing on earth is to live within that balance, Lady Eboshi kind of only can see the environment as an impediment to security and to safety. It's not as though she is going out and chopping down trees because it gives her any sort of sense of joy. It is a necessity to protect the people that she cares about. And she is very callous and very dismissive of the natural world. She fears the wolves that have attacked her convoy more than she desires to understand them or try to live with their existence. It is being confronted by these gods, these oversized, intelligent animals in nature, and only seeing a need to kill them to promote security. It's an understandable reaction, but it's also an ugly one. And it's, at the end of the day, it's a really important sort of consideration when thinking about human nature throughout history and its relationship with the environment.
Absolutely. I think you are right about saying Lady Eboshi's position there. And now that you mention it too, I think that might be one of Miyazaki's greater themes now that I'm putting these together, is that, even though Eboshi is using the environment, it's the lack of respect to the environment and those in it that really separates her, that really puts her to be more of a villain, even though her means are very redeeming. Could have easily avoided a lot of stuff, just commune with the spirits, bro. Like, just, talk to them. They'll give you some stuff. You'll be fine. Everybody will be living their best life. But no, you had to go in there and just get at it. It's understandable, but.
And her actions have provoked a really kind of perverse, desperate response to the environment. Her perspective and Ashitaka's perspective are juxtaposed by the tribe of apes outside of Irontown who throw sticks and try to plant new trees despite the fact they know they're going to get chopped down. They almost understand, or they feel, that the fight for the environment is totally in vain and they are clutching at straws. And Eboshi has pushed them to that point through her leadership. And yet, at the same time, the people who are getting the opportunity to develop the rifles and develop the firepower for this village are, for lack of a better word, lepers. People who are diseased or disfigured, the so-called untouchables of society. Is she has given them a place and a purpose. And it's part of Miyazaki's overall deceit in nearly every film he's done, is there's never a clear-cut villain. He is almost more comfortable portraying humans than he is trying to portray archetypes.
Exactly. I think that is exactly what I'm trying to say, Space, is he is so good at making these multi-dimensional characters and really kind of displaying the human condition, really, than actually making characters or stereotypes or tropes even. Even when you try to put them as tropes, you're like, wow, I can't.
And that's what makes the little confrontations and the rise of conflict in his stories so beautiful. And we really get that first true clash of the environment versus industry the moment that Sin and the wolves show up in the village in a surprise attack in an attempt to kill Lady Eboshi. Now, BK, these aren't just any wolves. These are gods of the forest. These are the last of their kind. These are essentially Shinto spirits, as it were, that are trying to preserve their existence through the conduit of this one human, San, who she must fight for nature, but she's almost incapable of saving it.
They react and try to save it, the wolves they do, but there's nothing they can do to really prevent its ultimate demise or destruction.
It's a very nihilistic kind of viewpoint, isn't it?
Oh, totally. I think it's kind of shitty if you only look at it that way, but it is the fact. And I think it's interesting context too with Shintoism. You brought that up. At the time period that this film is set in, Shinto was getting resurgence at that time, but historically, immediately, really after that, Shintoism does kind of dissolve into Buddhism and loses its prominence as a primary religion and spirituality over in Japan. So I think noting that like the way the forest spirits react and again the inevitable demise is kind of commentary on that, of the decline of Shintoism throughout the years, as Shinto is the primary spiritual thing. Like, it is something so innate to a Japanese person. Like, everybody says they do it or they are Shinto. It's not something you really think about. But I think Miyazaki is trying to remind the viewers where it came from, and how it really shapes a Japanese person in all aspects of their ideals. And all of our characters here in the story, again, are shaped by the environment. And I would say a Shinto person would also say that is Shintoism, the nature, us, existence. And to see these characters approach nature in such different ways, it's really interesting when you start to really get attached to each character. And like we talk with San, she's one of the few female characters that really resonates me with a lot. Personally, seeing her as more or less one of the main characters of this and being able to kind of take action and not have to wait for someone to tell her what to do to protect something that matters to her is just a very interesting story. And to have what matters to her be nature itself, be the environment, be her home, be something greater than very superficial is very moving. And you start to kind of get attached, not just her, but also the world itself, the very nature of nature.
It's moving. It's very moving, but it is genuinely tragic in a way.
Yes.
Because she's caught in a very Sisyphean struggle. She is so dedicated to this protecting task, but she is ultimately, as we mentioned, incapable of finishing it. And it is in part because she is confronted with this disrespect for the traditions that she is fighting to uphold beyond just trying to uphold the environment. I thought you added some brilliant context in talking about the struggle between Shinto and Buddhism because, of course, this period was, I'd say, maybe 100, 200 years removed from when Zen Buddhism crossed over into Japan from China. So while Shinto was making a resurgence because of its identity in Japan, in being a very polytheistic religion compared to the monotheistic or sort of theistic tradition with an absence of a deity in Buddhism, there was this change in focus in how one would worship, I would assume, between a communal idea of religion versus a very individualized, very Western almost idea of religion. And you see that through Eboshi's reaction to Sun, and you ultimately see both Eboshi and San, despite wanting to be at each other's throats, are completely and totally incapable of removing one another because they are two sides of the same coin. And the only person who is able to come in between them is Ashitaka.
Absolutely. Again, and he's someone who views that balance, that there is that sort of middle ground, and he definitely looks for understanding. And I think that is most noticeable at the start of the film. And almost every encounter with a demon, Ashikata tries to reason with it, tries to negotiate, doesn't resort to violence initially. Any encounter tries to speak first and then actions, which is so interesting, versus the ladies here who are in those lanes kind of have to only act and react for survival on both sides.
It adds into what I think is one of the more interesting metaphors or the topics that comes up again and again in Princess Mononoke is this idea that inflexibility is one of the real enemies here. It's not anything tangible in the way that somebody acts or the way that somebody is as a person that makes them evil. It's their inability to shift their way of thinking. You know, Irontown, much like the substance iron, ultimately ends up being a fairly inflexible place, which is why Ashitaka has to leave with San in order to find a way of undoing his curse and of trying to restore balance to this conflict. Now, he is on death's door and requires San to save him and the forest spirit to save his life and restore his vitality. But he does make the decision to not be inflexible. And even though the village is grateful to him, his leaving is really that sign that he's not going to be on their side through this. Their experience and their existence is important to him because Ashitaka, is trying to balance all of these interests in finding an environment that will work for all parties, but he is meeting with massive resistance.
I think that moment really is the turning point of the film, though, where the motivation and like decision making kind of begins and starts to take into effect. It's no longer going along for this ride or figuring out this journey. It turns into actionable items and things for change, really, now that he has this second chance.
As things do pick up rather quickly, you start meeting characters that will become vital to the climax of the film, or indeed being reintroduced to them. It's very telling in terms of characters and their relationship to the environment that the first time you see Jigo outside of civilization and in the forest, he is wearing a bear skin, as are many of his hunters. And you recognize in that moment that Jigo, he sees nature as a tool. It's ever so slightly different from the way that Lady Eboshi disrespects nature. His disrespect is in getting to the crux of that idea that everyone wants everything. Eboshi wants security. That is her everything, and it means that she must go against the environment. Jigo is actively looking to exploit it. He's actively looking to kill the forest spirit. And because of that, he, while being, self-interested and being human, becomes an extremely dangerous character at this point.
I low-key think Jigo is the representation of Buddhism, and him trying to get the head of the forest spirit is like him trying to consume or take over the Shintoist beliefs. I low-key think that's what it is.
That's a very interesting way of looking at it, because this is the segment of the film where religion becomes very overt in its symbolism, because this is when we meet the Boar clan led by Akoto.
Oh, the Boar clan. Oh man, the Boar clan. Also, sidebar guys, this movie is hella spoopy for no reason. It is. The voices of the boars are scary, and the goop stuff is okay.
Yes, we're getting to that point in the movie where it does take a very dark turn leading into its climax, and part of that darkness is the doomed nature of these boars. Now, BK, I struggled on sort of what their significance was in the context of the environment, in the context of the religious struggle that is going on in the undercurrents of the story. And what I realized upon this viewing is that the boars represent, to me, the rigidity of established religious tradition. They are the old practitioners of Shinto, as it were. They are so dedicated to the forest that they will knowingly prepare themselves for death in a final confrontation with the humans. They are so stuck in their way of being, in their way of belief, that they cannot see anything other than their very radical interpretation of the way the paradigm should settle itself. And again, it's another party introducing these elements of inflexibility into the situation that not only makes conflict and violence inevitable, but also really gives you an understanding as a viewer that flexibility and that understanding that you are going to have to bridge many needs in the context of this ecosystem is vitally important.
I really do see the boars that way. Like, they really did just kind of run to their slaughter, like, wouldn't even listen to anything. Just trying to save them. Hey, look, like, y'all don't need to die for this. Actually, you can still exist, in tandem. Like, that's a very interesting narrative there too, with the existence of Shintoism and Buddhism existing at the same time, rather than either it's only Shinto or not, or right, whatever religious belief you have that has been the primary focus here, it has to be that, and there's no other option. There's no room for growth. There's no room for understanding. So I think you might be onto something, Jack.
And of course, I think there's a great irony in the fact that Akoto, when he finally meets his demise in being confronted with the tree spirit, is blind. He has been totally blinded to anything beyond the present reality. Is that he and his tribe have been mowed down by Jigo and his hunters in conjunction with the villagers from Irontown, in what is depicted as a really gruesome, very violent battle. That's the thing about Mononoke that brings you to this idea of, is it pro or anti-war? Because it certainly doesn't glorify war or conflict in these scenes. You see depictions of PTSD in a soldier literally cowering in a hole. You see people's arms getting chopped off, their heads getting sliced from the neck. This is not a PG film. The violence is very real in these scenes, and it serves a very tangible point in bringing proceedings to a head. It's necessitated by all this inflexibility. Is for a while there, it looks as though Ashitaka, in running around the forest trying to save San, trying to save the boars, trying to save Irontown from an attack from a rival samurai clan, trying to stop Jigo from killing the forest spirit. He has so many responsibilities and is being confronted by so many inflexible parties in leading up to the climactic moments of this film that failure feels far more certain for him than success.
Yeah, this is definitely not a film where it feels like there's going to be a happy ending. Literally into the last moment, you really don't know what type of ending you're getting into this film. And to double back on that last scene you were talking about, the boar scene, right? I think that scene is one of the most heavily animated moments other than the intro fight with the boar. Throughout the whole film, they spent the most time on those two particular scenes in the animation process.
That's the thing about this film is while there was a certain amount of controversy around it, I seem to remember in researching this that there was some light use of CGI in sort of the burgeoning days of that field. Most of this film, the overwhelming majority, is done in the animatic style that was pioneered by Disney. That opening scene took 2 years for them to draw out. This battle scene probably took them about 2 years as well, judging by the level of detail.
Absolutely. I think the notable thing about the CGI for this film, I'll go off just a little, is another film that came out around the same time was, you guys might know, Treasure Planet.
Good film.
Yeah, that film there also used CGI in a similar way. Most of it, if not all of it, was 2D hand-drawn. But some elements, like the goop in Princess Mononoke around Ashitaka's arm, and then I think the little blob, like in Treasure Planet, they used CGI there and a little bit of 3D rendering to kind of add that depth and realism, like playing around with animation. One of Hayao Miyazaki's notes when making this film was like, let's use CGI not as like the bread and butter. It's just going to accent and accentuate what we already do. We don't want to rely on it. So I kind of appreciate that. A lot of people have, their controversy on it. It needs to be pure and all that bullshit. But I think it's bullshit because no one's really applauding at him at combining the two, which had never been done before. No one ever, put CGI on top of 2D like that to kind of make it look believable like that. So I say applaud him for it. Don't chastise him. All right.
It's hard to think about. It's hard to think about in 2020, but I remember at 6 years old watching stuff like Independence Day and thinking those fighter pilot sequences look next level, and then I go back now and it looks like PlayStation 2 graphics at best. It's amazing how unwieldy CGI was in its early days, which is why stuff like Toy Story is special, and why I think Princess Mononoke's very judicious use of CGI is special, because you bring up the goop, and we're right there at where it sort of makes its presence felt. Now, you and I have both noticed through watching Miyazaki films together that he has this focus on goop, on amorphous sort of blobular characters or blobular characteristics as particularly evil and particularly it's hard to describe what it means. If I was going to sort of give into very heavy-handed environmental symbolism, you would, liken it to an oil spill. But I don't know if that is necessarily what it really means. I think that's almost too easy. It comes about in Mononoke at this, probably the darkest moment of the film. Lady Eboshi manages to kill and behead with an iron bullet the forest spirit, completely cuts its head off with a shot. And it's a sad moment because it is the film telling you that the ecosystem that existed when this film was created, like the balance that we thought we have as a human race, it doesn't really exist. We're going to have to create a new one. The death of the forest spirit is a recognition that what we have is flawed and something has to be created anew, but it's being created anew in Mononoke through a deeply violent act.
Oh, I got so sidetracked. I'm over here still trying to figure out what this blob means. You can't just throw that out at me and then bring me on a journey to the next segment. And I'm over here like, but what does the blob and the goop mean?
Oh, I don't mean to lead you away. I consider them related because again, the death of this, the understanding of this old ecosystem being untenable the immediate reaction to that ecosystem becoming untenable is everything is covered with goop that literally kills everything it touches.
And it destroys it. And maybe it's a metaphor. Maybe it's like, hey, look, well, now the Shintoism that was being revered is now being used in the wrong way, is being manipulated or being toyed with. But I think it's more than that. I think the environmentalism one is easy, like you said. So I don't want to give it just that. I know there's a couple Japanese like yokai, ghosts, and spirit thingies, like spooky ghosts that have a similar form, I guess. So maybe that's kind of where it birthed from, but nothing that looks like it.
What we have here, I think, BK, is a bit of an impasse. Is I like to believe, through all of my various film education, I like to believe I'm pretentious enough to come up with a metaphorical significance for pretty much anything I can.
Anything.
But with the goop and the way that Miyazaki uses it in Spirited Away and Howl's Moving Castle and all of these different films, I'm a bit stumped. This totally amorphous sort of characteristic is, to him and his filmmaking, representative of something very destructive. But I almost feel like you'd have to pick Miyazaki's brain personally to figure out what he kind of imparts to that. I kind of feel like I'd be cheapening the destructive nature of this symbol and the way it functions in his worlds by trying to give it my own sort of significance, which is a weird thing to say when you're analyzing a film, but there it is.
Valid. I think you're right. I think the only thing that sticks with me the most or puts me in a good direction is just maybe reference from a lot of like traditional Japanese yokai, which are like ghost monsters. But I think each one of those, so give you context, which is to why I can't tell you what it means as well, is because each yokai or monster usually has a very specific story and has a very specific meaning for what the yokai is or where the yokai is found. So I'd have to do a lot of digging to figure it out, but now I'm like extra motivated. If we do another Miyazaki film, I'm gonna come with the receipts. All right, guys, like, so you gotta let us know.
Oh, please do. And I mean that all tracks with I have a relatively small knowledge of Japanese ghost stories. What I know, I basically know from the way it was depicted in Hausu. But that being said, the goop, it threatens to swallow everything. It threatens to swallow all of these different inflexible parties. Those who are looking to use the forest as a tool, those who see the forest as an impediment, those who see progress as the only possibility. All of these people are stuck in a situation where if they are profaned against nature, they're having to pay a price. You see it most vividly with Lady Eboshi when the wolf's head, in a final act of defiance, bites off her arm, takes the instrument of humanity that she used to fell the forest spirit. But everyone is paying a price at the end here by witnessing the destruction of their ecosystem before their very eyes. They're seeing this turning point. But because this is Miyazaki and because he is nothing if not dogged in finding a happy ending through all of his chaos, we do get a happy ending, BK.
Guys, of course you do. Amongst all the despair, finally, all of our characters are like, well, we all want to survive, right? I guess we need nature to exist still. The goop is indiscriminately gooping, all right? We've got to stop it. And sure enough, they come together, or each character makes the biggest sacrifice they've ever had to make, I feel,
yes,
to accomplish this goal. So whether it is, our monk who has to give up his main quest for people to be saved, Iron Town for Lady Eboshi has to be destroyed. It can't exist in its current format. Ashitaka needs to be willing to give his own life for something, and the life of maybe someone he loves. So I think that's why it is down to just him and San to fully invest it and accept that they might have to be the ones to die for this to be okay. And sure enough, the forest spirit is able to kind of put himself back together and give this sort of rebirth, the Fantasia element, rebirth and new life all over of Japan. And I think it's really interesting because it is Ashitaka who is the main character, and his name actually means like a bright tomorrow. That's what that translates to.
That's kind of wonderful knowing that. I of course had no idea that is what his name is, what his name signifies. But that is beautiful because the climax is it's not what you would expect in a traditional fantasy film. It's not a swashbuckling sword fight or anything of that nature. It is this moment of convincement, of getting Jigo and getting a greedy person to give up in this ultimate moment of greed. Like the real villain in Princess Mononoke throughout has been greed and to a lesser degree arrogance. It is not that any of these people are evil, it's that their pursuits corrupt them, and that their wants and their desires make them evil in the eyes of this conflict. And there has to be a resolution to that, and it comes not through paying the ultimate price of losing your life for your greed or your arrogance. It comes with a need to understand that you have to forego those earthly wants to save people in a collective way. It comes from the investment of we have to give the forest spirit its head back in a way that is going to expose us to more of the curse that was put upon Ashitaka's arm at the beginning. And I think, to me, at the very end of this film, I think one of the coolest details is that Ashitaka's scar does fade from its initial point in the film when it is marked with this sort of reddish purple bruise all over his arm. It fades, but it doesn't completely disappear. And I loved that because I took that as this really significant message that even in finding a new day, in finding a new ecosystem to replace the one that the forest spirit has had to leave behind in its final act, human beings have to kind of carry the knowledge of their sins, the knowledge of their evils with them. And Ashitaka is quite literally forced to do that through the physical remains of the curse still being present.
I'm glad you pointed that out. I didn't catch that on my first one, but now I'm thinking about it, I'm like, oh, you're totally right. It doesn't fully fade. And that's so smart for you to say that. Like, not just the whole learn your lesson. It's more like this is something that lives with you. This is something you have to carry.
It's the type of message I think it's hard to understand and translate in America because we are such an individualistic society. And it really does, we talked about Miyazaki and his sort of relationship with World War II and with the sort of cultural affectations that came with that. The ending really is an atomic bomb kind of moment. It is people coming together and unifying in the face of this gigantic threat. And, it's something we'd like to believe from the best of ourselves, but there is, as Mononoke shows, and I think it might be the greatest testament this film has in terms of the ways that you can interpret it, is it recognizes that matter-of-fact nature of conflict. It recognizes that the struggles against individual will and individual want and desire are going to be a fundamental part of any battle, any movement towards a better tomorrow, whether it be for the environment or if it be for human progress or what have you. But Princess Mononoke is very uncompromising in the way in which it delivers that message, in the way it makes you see that struggle from every side without taking a side. Ashitaka is our protagonist, but he is merely one of several viewpoints that is absolutely critical to the message of this film. And it is just a very, very smartly written and very smartly executed, I think, BK.
Oh, totally. I think I want to bring it into my final little tidbit of controversy involving this film. It was a conversation about what to name this, because it's arguably debatable who is the main character. Now, the name of the film is Princess Mononoke, but the main heroine's name is not Mononoke. Her name is San.
That's correct.
There's a little bit of that where the Western audiences didn't actually understand what the film was about because they never met a Mononoke throughout the whole film. But a couple before that being chosen as the title, it was Miyazaki and his producer going back and forth about whether or not to call it Princess Mononoke or The Legend of Ashitaka.
Really?
Yes, and it was in fact, I believe, Toshio who doubled down and said he would not go through with it if it was not named Princess Mononoke. And Miyazaki still to this day prefers the other title for this film, which is very interesting. I see why, because at the end of the day, it is his story. But I think personally, having it be called Princess Mononoke has a lot of weight for me. It also emphasizes the role women play in this, which was a big thing to me about how women were portrayed throughout the film, and we touched on that. So to imagine this film without that title, I think you're almost doing a disservice to the film and kind of not crediting enough what San's existence to the whole story is, and kind of giving it all to Ashitaka in him, even though this is his legend. This is the story they would tell is about him, not of San. Because if it's not a character in the film, what is a Mononoke? And a Mononoke is like the word for a spirit, a strange or unknowable creature. It is often in Japanese mythology, if that's how you say it. They talk about it specifically as a woman, it is a woman that is a strange, ethereal, spiritual thing. And that is very much what San is in the film. And the title then would be directly translated as like Princess of the Spirits, and not necessarily, Mononoke as a name.
And not to get in the middle of this struggle between Miyazaki and Suzuki, but I'm kind of on Toshio Suzuki's side on this one. I feel like it is really important to point out the feminine in the film because, while there are passive male characters in this, I can't think of a single female character, whether it is Lady Eboshi, whether it is the Wolf Mother, whether it is Toki, one of the sort of rehabilitated women who runs the Bellows and kind of helps run Irontown. Like,
oh, my girl.
The women are unbelievably active, and especially in San's case, where she is running around trying to save the forest, even if it's in vain, she is active in her pursuits. She's active in her desire to save this order as it exists. And while that turns out to be ultimately futile, it doesn't mean that her actions were any less important. And I think that broad focus is probably one of the things that translates well in looking back on this film in this environment where we are almost a point of over-inundation with Japanese culture, is that in America, we are exposed to so much of it, whether it's new animes on Netflix, whether it's getting new films announced, on a regular basis. But when Mononoke came out and hit the States, it was at a time when, as I mentioned earlier in the podcast, Japanese culture, or specifically Japanese animation, was kind of looked at as not just a niche, but as very niche, as the sort of refuge of complete and utter nerds, basement dwellers. And if I could go off on a little bit of the significance here, Princess Mononoke, it grossed $150 million worldwide. It did very well for itself at the box office, but only $2 million of that was in the United States in 1997 and 1998. It would be hard to credit it with being the spark of this movement, but it was a part of this real wave from about 1997 through 2002, which is when Spirited Away would come out, where Japanese animation, through conduits like Toonami and the birth of Adult Swim around the turn of the century, started to give that style a voice in America. That's the time period when we started to get Sailor Moon, Dragon Ball Z, Evangelion, Yu Yu Hakusho, Tenchi Muyo, Ronin Warriors, Gundam Wing, Cowboy Bebop, Outlaw Star, Trigun, Rurouni Kenshin, Inuyasha. Like, these anime that we consider the foundational basis of understanding Japanese culture as it impacted America, this all took place between the release in America of Princess Mononoke and the American release of Spirited Away. And Spirited Away would go on to do a global box office of $275 million, which was not quite double what Princess Mononoke had grossed. However, the American gross was $10 million compared to the $2 million for Mononoke. Is the audience for anime, it stands to reason based on the financials, had grown fivefold in 5 years. This style just had started to hit in the United States in a way that it just didn't. And it is because, I think in part, we had serious work like Princess Mononoke to reference that it gained real strength and real ability.
Absolutely. And when you put into perspective that 5 times in 5 years, like that is the birth of an industry, bro. That is a sustainable culture there in the West that is seen by those numbers. And you are totally right. I would go so far to say Princess Mononoke is probably the first Japanese work people really know at that. I mean, you do have Akira, but some people that wasn't their speed, and it didn't hit, I feel, in the emotional and overall experience that something like a Miyazaki film does hit with. And then you have all of these fairly serious works that follow after it. Like we aren't getting the throwaways like Cutie Honey, which is like, scandalous versions of Sailor Moon. Like we were getting gems.
You did not.
Okay.
You did not just bring up Cutie Honey.
I'm just saying though, like Cutie Honey is like, we like it. It's for the culture, but that's not the works that we were finally getting like good dubs on and eyes on. We were getting things like Neon Genesis, right? Things like Cowboy Bebop, which will go on to be literally, like you said, classic staples. Honestly, the gatekeepers of all the gatekeepers will run this list by you and see if you know some of them on it, right? So that's what to me feels like it was a birth of an era with this film, where it showed that Japanese animation could be taken seriously and could be dubbed effectively. Because really the dub, to be honest, I think the localization is really important. I am a sub fan here, right? Subs over dubs. However,
Fair.
It can be hard for people. Sometimes subtitles could be a huge barrier for people to be exposed to just foreign films in general or TV shows, just a whole new culture, right? But for animation specifically, that sub barrier, because you are watching so many things happen on the screen and they aren't real people, your focus does need to be on the experience as a whole, and you might miss out on frames when you are looking for subtitles. So I get why dub is such a great entryway to people, and it makes you feel like it can be applied to you by hearing those voices spoken in that similar dialect to you, rather than trying to understand the nuances of Japanese communication. There are jokes that you might not get in direct translations from subtitles that, if they're localized correctly, you can get the same humor and the same effect in English. And having that care to that was really, in this era, I think, is what made it just so accessible. So when Spirited Away came out, everyone was primed and ready. We were like, let's go, buckle up, baby, hit me with it.
And it helps, I think, that the English language cast for Mononoke is so unbelievably strong. You're getting contributions from Billy Crudup as Ashitaka, Billy Bob Thornton as Jigo, Minnie Driver as Lady Eboshi, Gillian Anderson has a role, Keith David has a role, John DiMaggio, who would go on to voice Bender in Futurama, has a prominent role in this film. Jada Pinkett Smith is involved. The list goes on of this incredible diverse talent within the United States and British acting scenes that would come together to do this film. And it would set a precedent for all of the Miyazaki dubs that would come after. Is a Miyazaki dub in this day and age is now almost permanently associated with getting a dynamite cast, but Mononoke was the start of that. And I thought it was so great that you mentioned this was dubbed well, because it is a tired criticism, I think, of a lot of Japanese animation and a lot of Japanese content, especially if you're someone who has an appreciation for it, that it, is badly dubbed, or that everything has to be spoken like Speed Racer, and we are going to try and time the vocals to everything that Speed is saying. Haha, we're going to drive the car very fast. Is that, that was the growing pains for Japanese animation, and we all know it. And we do appreciate the ways it is made fun of. We had to have Astro Boy and Speed Racer so that we could have Cowboy Bebop, so that we could have Elfen Lied. These cornerstones of seriousness and real drama that we understand now.
Yes.
And, we're at a point where even a bad dub, Death Note, can, not really ruin the significance of the impact that Japanese animation actually has on America to this day. And Mononoke being a part of that first wave is truly significant to me.
It's time for the rating space.
Oh, yes.
So, I don't know, coupled with cultural significance and literally probably, between Natsuka and San, those were my female leads growing up. So this is can't be anything lower than a 6, which sucks. But then I feel like every movie we're going to watch, I'm going to rate the goddamn same rating. I'm going to be so tight. But for me, I'd have to say this film is, I think it would be a 9. Solid 9. I think not a 10 because it is real. It is real. It is a very, very real, very raw movie. And sometimes those are just not the best in my book, if that makes sense. Sometimes there's something about something being just so real, you can't give it that 10 out of 10 if it doesn't hit a specific thing personally, if that makes sense. So for me, I'm not a war person, Apocalypse Now, guys, So, but the Shinto themes really get me going. But if it was a little less war, more about, the original village, more about the spirits, more about Dawn, more about her situation, I probably would give it that 10 out of 10. But because it is war focused, because it is on that tiny lens, when I feel like there's a whole world he built that I would have loved to explore more, that's why it doesn't get the 10 out of 10 for me.
I can appreciate it. BK, because I'm not going low. I'm certainly not going low. But I think for me, I give Princess Mononoke an 8, but I give it an 8. It's so unfair because I give it an 8 almost because of my own ignorance. I think that what Princess Mononoke does well and where it really succeeds, first and foremost, artistic aesthetic. Second of all, it succeeds brilliantly in its sound design, which, we haven't given nearly enough credit, but it took a team of 26 different designers and mixers to create one of the most realistically mixed soundscapes I've ever heard in an animation, TV show, film, otherwise. It is beautiful work. And I really appreciate the way in which the film really plays around and toys with perspective, the way it doesn't make you totally comfortable in understanding the story from one particular viewpoint. I think where it loses out on the last 2 stars for me is because it's hard for me to personalize something from a culture that is not one that I'm familiar with. And I'd feel uncomfortable in a lot of ways trying to heighten my relationship to the culture as an outsider, because I think it's important to understand when you are watching something from an outside perspective. Certainly we're going to be, in the course of doing Revenge of the Film Nerds, watching, several foreign films, not just from Japan. I will eventually be convincing you to watch some French New Wave and some Italian neo-realist stuff that will probably bore you to death. But having said that, the importance of seeing Japanese cinema and appreciating that it exists in this paradigm that is very much related to World War II and the post-war miracle and the fading of the post-war miracle in the 90s, that these cultural and historical hallmarks play a very important role in Japanese cinema because I don't have that firsthand experience with it, I can't fully relate to it the way that I think Miyazaki really wants the people of Japan to relate to his work. And so that's why it scores an 8 for me. It has very little to do with Miyazaki's intent and everything to do with the fact that I am an ignorant foreigner when it comes to this film.
But it goes to show, though, how deep the roots are of that Japanese cultural influence and significance in this film. So I think that's fine. I think Miyazaki would be fine with you saying that, you watched it multiple times. I think that's all he really cares about.
Oh yeah, no, I will. This is absolutely the type of film that I will plop in on a whim because it is so well executed and it is a real escape. And I think that is kind of one of the nice things about being a film nerd is that a film doesn't have to be perfect to let you escape into it. There is a vital role that film does play in being an escapist art form, is that I love appreciating those films like Apocalypse Now that really grip you and make you focus on the world. But I do appreciate that ability to just sit back and enjoy a film for what it is. And Mononoke, does, for all its heaviness, does give you those opportunities. However, BK, next week,
Okay.
you want to talk escapism. We are tackling a truly incredible action adventure film. We are going to be sitting down and watching Raiders of the Lost Ark, directed by Steven Spielberg.
Yes, I am very excited for this. For those of you who want to preemptively flame me, I have yet to see Raiders of the Lost Ark or any of the original series, so this is going to be great.
It burns. It literally burns.
I'm sorry, guys, but this is why the podcast is here. We get to introduce me to new stuff and vice versa, and I'm really excited to kind of take a step away from the war, get caught up into a nice adventure to see our ideal heroine or hero, whoever.
Yes, we're stepping away from a war to watch Indiana Jones fight Nazis.
Hey, sign me up, baby. I'll take it.
But yeah, this is a film. I largely use the word blame with love, but I largely blame my parents for turning me into a film buff at an early age, and it's because I cannot remember a time when we did not own the Indiana Jones trilogy. We don't speak of the fourth one. The original Star Wars trilogy, and all 16 of the Bond movies from 62 to 89. Those were the films that formed the basis of my film viewership and my early love of film. So getting to visit Raiders of the Lost Ark in a critical context is going to be a lot of fun for me, especially because for something that is meant to be an action serial and a testament of love to the action serial, there is a lot of critical symbolism in this film that is vitally important, interesting to go into. So I am excited to be introducing you to this film, BK, and I am very touched that I can show to you for the first time because it's a film that I love.
I'm super, super, super excited. I think it's really dope for those of you who were able to join us for the viewing of Mononoke in the Discord this week. We'll try to do some of those more going forward. It just takes time and scheduling. But for Raiders of the Lost Ark, I'll be sure to come packed with my reactions because I know y'all love it. And I know Jack is going to have all the tidbits for production, so I'm ready to geek out. I grew up in Florida, so I know about the attractions at Disney. That's all my frame of reference is, okay? So I'm ready to buckle up, strap on in.
We are so glad to be bringing you Revenge of the Film Nerds, and you are able to find us now. We are listed on Apple Podcasts. We are listed on Spotify. We are on Stitcher. We are in the process of getting on Google Podcasts. We are on Podcast Addict. We are on Podchaser. And, of course, we are with our lovely hosts at Buzzsprout. And, this process only continues to get better and better and more fun for us. And when we're not doing this, we're still trying to be creatives. BK, where can they find your creative content?
You guys can find me on Instagram and on Twitch at Black Crystal. That's where your girl at. And you got to let them know Jack yourself, too.
Absolutely. Is you can find my personal content on Instagram and on Twitter and on Facebook at ManlyJackManly. That last one is Manley. Yes, it is my real last name. My parents were very smart in naming me. And if you are looking for anything that I'm going to be up to in the near future, gyms are coming back at limited capacity in New York City. So that means the World of Unpredictable Wrestling will be back at it soon. And you can find them and me at WUW Wrestling on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. It has been a blast, BK, as always, talking about film. And I am excited to get to Raiders of the Lost Ark next week. So, folks, I am Jack Manley.
And I'm Black Crystal. Thank you so much for watching and listening to Revenge of the Film Nerds.
Take care, everybody. Peace and chicken grease.
Got it.